You can make all the noise you want because I'm trimming. Welcome back. This will be the second autobiographical video. I will talk about my intellectual rather than personal development. And I will begin with the observation that although I'm going to put my career in perspective for you, there's a trajectory and logic that is apparent in it, but only in retrospect. At the time, it was not at all evident what I was doing. At most, I was focused on a small or particular project. Only later did I begin to think how it might fit into a larger agenda. More problematic still, and actually psychologically upsetting at the time, was the fact that what I was doing was interdisciplinary. So I drew on history, psychology, to address international relations. This took some time to come together. I received my tenure in 1971 and realized that I now had time to work on a major project rather than churning out books and articles to satisfy a tenure committee. I took 10 years to write Between Peace and War, which in retrospect seems like a long time since I churn out a book a year these days. But at the time, it didn't seem so long. I worked to get my knowledge of all of these crises up in detail, as well as mastering literature in both international relations and psychology. I wondered if I ever was going to finish the book and how my ideas would come together in a large project. Fortunately, it congealed, the book was well received, and this was Between Peace and War, The Nature of International Crisis. It was published in 1981, and this coming next year, 2021, Palgrave will be publishing a 40th anniversary version of the book. It has 3 new chapters that bring it up to date, and it also talks about what led me to the book and the sense of discovery as I did my research and writing. It, of course, reflected my interest in conflict management and prevention. I wrote it in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the interest that people had in studying crises, with the thought that if there was a World War III, it would likely be a crisis of some kind that would trigger it and possibly spin out of control. It led to any number of other books and articles that applied psychology to the problem of conflict, and in particular an effort to show that the strategy and theory of deterrence were deeply flawed, that deterrence as a strategy was more likely to bring about the kind of conflict it sought to prevent, given the way Americans and Soviets actually practiced it. My interest in international relations theory continued, largely because at the time I thought it had real practical value. It's what led me to do it, this connection between theory and praxis. To my regret, it's had little effect. Belief in deterrence is deeply entrenched. Research that challenged it was shunted aside. It wasn't taken all that seriously. And this was true of many of my other writings in the field, which were largely orthogonal to the beliefs of the national security community in the United States. I made something of a reputation as a scholar, but not one who had any public influence. The lesson of this, to me, was to turn even deeper to investigating the conceptual foundations not only of policies, but the ways in which we think about the world and the concepts we use to create our conceptions of foreign policy and international relations. So I moved increasingly into political theory and philosophy of science, having written several books in those areas, all engaging deep questions of what's the nature of cause? Is it real? Is it an artifact of the mind? And if the latter, as I believe it is, what are the consequences for research? I argue that we can never make more than rhetorical claims of causes, and that we need to develop different ways of framing causal inquiry, and I'll give a talk on this in another video. The point here is that these efforts engage serious intellectual problems in their own right, but they also have the goal to pull the rug out from underneath the ways in which social science frames its inquiry, and to develop an alternative epistemology. So in recent years, this has taken the form of a number of found expression in a number of books, all of which are related, beginning with the publication in 2003 of The Tragic Vision of Politics, which sought to recapture the wisdom of classical realism and use it to critique realpolitik and to offer another way of thinking about foreign policy, one embedded in ethics and one that recognizes that the most serious threats to security are those that originate at home, that have little to do very often with foreign threats. This was followed by a cultural theory of international relations, which I believe is the only full-blown constructivist theory of international relations. I'll give a talk about it in due course. A book on counterfactuals, forbidden fruit, which tried to show not only how counterfactuals are essential to our analysis, but even more important, how by using counterfactuals we can take ourselves outside of our own world and get a different perspective on it, and use it not only to evaluate our world, but to pose questions of contingency of events that have happened. This is important because IR theories are based on alleged lessons of major events, particularly World War I and II, and interpretations of how they began. If those events were contingent, as I believe World War I was, and if their origins were quite different from what dominant theories propose, then we open space for new ways of thinking about these problems and of conflict in general. I went on to write 2 books about identity, which I'll talk about later, but also because of the involvement of constructivism with identity and using it as a source or an explanation for foreign policy behavior. My argument being that this is deeply problematic for reasons I won't go into now. And that was followed up by a particularly recent book, Reason and Cause, which argues that both these both these concepts are not universal and objective as social science contends, but rather are historically and culturally specific, that the current understanding of reason and cause is the result of psychological problems and a response to them by people in the late 19th and early 20th century. So here too I'm trying to pull the rug out from underneath positivist social science. The project of tragic vision and cultural theory was part of a trilogy which I finally finished with the rise and fall of political orders, which looks at, in the deepest sense, why political orders develop, what services or functions they form for people, how they stay afloat, and ultimately what makes them fragile and might even bring about their demise. A particularly timely question in the year 2020. But I've still maintained my interest in conflict management and relations, and most recently did a democratic foreign policy, which again is an attempt to show the serious flaws of realpolitik and to argue that politics, or that ethics and domestic politics don't stop at the water's edge, as realists allege, but rather are absolutely central to the formation of foreign policy. Most recently, I've co-authored with Feng Zhang, a mainland Chinese scholar, a work that takes my overall approach to conflict management and prevention, which appeared a couple of years back in a book called Avoiding War and Making Peace, of taking it and applying it to Sino-American relations, arguing that there are no substantive interests that should lead these countries into conflict, looking at the largely psychological reasons and the quest for standing on both sides that have been a primary cause, and what could be done to alleviate it and build a more cooperative relationship. So here I am, approaching the age of 79, still deeply involved in my research agenda, feeling frustrated that it hasn't had the policy impact that I had hoped it would, but feeling deeply satisfied by this process of intellectual discovery and personal growth to which it has led. Thank you.